Ever imagine like being able to predict injuries
Mm-hmm.
before they even happen?
Yeah.
That's the kind of potential we're diving into today.
Wow.
The world of computational biomechanics.
Okay.
So think computers, math,
Mm-hmm.
but for understanding how our bodies move.
Yeah.
So joining us today is to help us break it all down.
So I'm excited to dive into this.
Awesome. Glad to have you here.
Yeah.
So this field is just changing everything.
It really is.
Healthcare, sports, you name it.
Yeah.
And our deep dive today is going to zoom in on an area that's particularly exciting,
Okay.
using immersive technology to model what's called the neuromusculoskeletal system,
Yeah.
NMS for short.
NMS.
So basically all the stuff that lets us move, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Bones, muscles, tendons.
All the good stuff.
Even the nerves calling the shots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got the muscles, the tendons, the bones, and then the nervous system is kind of like the control system.
It's telling everything what to do.
It's like the puppet master. So yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
All right, so we got the NMS. We kind of know what it is,
Right.
what makes it so tricky to study.
Well, it's really fascinating because our bodies have what's called muscle redundancy.
Muscle redundancy.
Muscle redundancy.
That sounds complicated.
It means there's a ton of ways to do the same movement.
So like picking up this cup,
Yeah, exactly.
my brain could choose
You got it.
from like tons of different muscle combinations to get that done.
Yeah, like just for that simple task, your brain has to coordinate, dozens of muscles
Really?
to pick up that cup.
I'm using way more muscles than I think I am.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is your brain does it all subconsciously. You don't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
You just decide you want to pick up the cup and your brain takes care of the rest.
That's wild.
Yeah, it is wild. It's a complex system.
I never really thought about it that way.
I know. It's pretty amazing.
So how did scientists even like approach studying this
Yeah.
before we had these fancy computer models?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Like what do they actually do?
So before we had computational models, scientists had to rely on a lot of external observation and measurement.
Okay, so it's kind of like watching
Right.
and taking notes.
Yeah, it was a lot of observing.
Like watching someone move
Yeah.
or using medical imaging.
Exactly. So they would use things like x-rays, MRIs to see the bones and the muscles.
When they could measure like the forces when your foot hits the ground.
Yeah, so that's called force plate analysis.
Okay,
And they would have these platforms that measure the forces.
I see.
And they would also look at the electrical activity in the muscles.
The electrical activity in muscles.
Yeah, so that's called electromyography, or EMG for short.
Okay.
And it basically involves putting little electrodes on the skin over the muscles, and you can actually see when a muscle is activated.
So you get like a snapshot of what muscles you're engaging and when.
Exactly. And that gives you some insight into how the muscles are being used during movement.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of data, right?
It is. It's a lot of data.
But I'm guessing it was kind of hard to get like the full picture
Yeah, you're exactly right.
of what was going on.
So the problem with these traditional methods
Yeah.
is that while they provide valuable information,
Yeah.
they have some limitations,
Okay.
and they are expensive and time-consuming.
Sounds like it.
And it's really hard to see what's going on inside the body
Mm-hmm.
during these complex movements.
You can see what the foot's doing.
Right.
Or what the arm is doing.
You can see the external movement.
But you don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
Like inside to cause it.
You don't know what's happening with the muscles and the tendons and the joints and how they're all working together.
And it makes it hard to replicate, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like if you're trying to do the same study
No,
with
very-
different people.
It's very hard to control for all the variables.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's hard to say for sure if the results are truly reliable.
So that's where computational biomechanics comes in.
That's exactly where it comes in.
Okay.
It's really revolutionizing how we study movement.
Okay.
Because now we can create these detailed models of the NMS and we can simulate all sorts of scenarios.
So we can like create a virtual stunt double to test things out.
That's a great way to put it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It's like having a digital twin of your musculoskeletal system.
But it's actually pretty straightforward. It's using math and computer science, basically, to create a virtual version of your musculoskeletal system. So your bones, joints, muscles, tendons, all of it. Think of it like a super high-tech digital puppet that mirrors the human body.
Okay, a digital puppet. That's a pretty cool image.
Right.
Okay, so we've got the basics of how these models work, but what about the model itself? What are the actual pieces that make up this digital puppet? Well, we start by taking each bone
Okay.
and we represent it as a rigid body, and it's kind of like a building block, and they each have their own properties like mass and inertia,
Okay.
and then all these little pieces, they're connected by joints.
Okay.
So it forms this structure that we call a model tree.
Model tree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Think of it like a family tree, but for your skeleton.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so it's not just a random pile of bone.
No. It's very organized.
There's like a structure to it, just like our own skeletons.
Exactly. And so each joint in the model,
Okay.
it's designed with specific degrees of freedom.
Okay.
So for example, like a knee joint, it's built to allow for bending and straightening just like a real knee, and that's how we get the accurate movements.
That makes sense. So we've built this model, but like...
How do we make it move?
Yeah, like what makes it go...
Well, that's where muscles come in.
Okay, so the muscles are like the engine.
Yeah, they're the actuators in our model.
Okay.
They generate the force needed for movement.
Okay.
We use these models like the Hill muscle model to calculate the forces. And it takes into account all sorts of physiological factors to figure out how much force the muscle is producing.
Wow.
And then that force causes the joints to rotate, and that's what makes the movement.
Okay, so it's not just like how strong the muscle is.
Right.
But it's like how that strength actually...
Turns into movement.
Yeah.
Exactly.
At the joint.
Right.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and for even more realism,
Okay.
the models take into account things like the springiness of tendons, the resistance of ligaments, the forces when you like touch the ground.
Wow.
It's like all of these things working together.
You're like recreating physics.
Practically.
Oh my gosh, in the computer.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
The source material actually mentions a lower body model
Okay.
with 15 different body parts, 14 joints that allow for 23 degrees of freedom, like bending your knee, and 92 muscle actuators. It even simulates contact with the floor.
92 muscle actuators. That's mind-boggling. Why so many?
Well, because each one represents a specific muscle or muscle group.
Okay.
And it allows researchers to study how they all work together to produce movement. This level of complexity, you know, it lets us do things that are impossible in a real lab.
Yeah.
Like isolate the action of a single muscle or tweak its properties.
Oh, wow.
Or even simulate injuries.
That's really cool. So it's like we have this digital crash test dummy, but one that moves with incredible realism.
Exactly.
But how do these simulations actually work?
Well, there's two main approaches.
Okay.
The inverse problem and the forward problem.
Okay.
They're kind of like two sides of the same coin, each giving us unique insights.
Interesting. Let's start with the inverse problem. It sounds a bit like detective work.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine we have footage of you running on a treadmill.
Okay.
We use motion capture, those suits with the reflective balls, you know, to track your every movement in 3D. Now, the inverse problem is all about figuring out the muscle forces and activations that made you move that way.
So it's like rewinding the tape and figuring out the precise recipe of muscle activity that created those movements.
You got it.
Cool.
And then that leads us to the forward problem. Here we start with a model and a specific set of muscle activation patterns. Then we run the simulation forward, like hitting play on a movie, to see how those activations translate into movement.
So the forward problem is about predicting how the body will move based on certain muscle commands.
Exactly. It's like giving instructions to our digital body and seeing what it does.
Got it.
Both approaches have their own strengths, you know? And together they give us this powerful toolkit for understanding human movement.
Okay, so for this inverse problem, detective work, what kind of data are we gathering?
Well, we need information about the person we're simulating.
Okay.
Starting with basic anthropometric measurements like height, weight, segment lengths, you know, like building a custom digital skeleton.
Right. Makes sense. What else?
Well, the motion capture data obviously provides the 3D map of the body's movement, but we also need to know about forces involved, like how much force your feet exert on the ground when you walk. That's where force plates come in.
Oh, okay.
They measure the ground reaction forces, which are key to understanding balance and gait.
So it's not just the positions of the limbs, it's also about the forces driving those movements.
Right.
What about muscle activity itself? How do we capture that?
That's where electromyography comes in, or EMG.
Okay.
We attach electrodes to the skin to record the electrical signals muscles produce.
Okay.
This tells us when and how hard they're working.
Wow. So we're gathering data from head to toe?
Yeah.
From the position of the limbs to the forces on the ground to the electrical activity in the muscles. What happens to all this data once we have it?
Well, it all gets fed into our virtual model. But we can't just use any generic model.
Right.
We need to scale it to match the individual's body dimensions.
Okay.
Like tailoring a digital suit for a perfect fit.
Makes sense.
Right.
But how do we know if our virtual suit actually fits?
Well, that's a crucial step called validation.
Okay.
We compare the virtual markers on the model with the real motion capture data,
Okay.
making sure they line up.
Right.
This makes sure that our virtual representation is accurate.
So it's a very meticulous process, but I can see why it's so important.
Yeah.
If the model isn't accurate,
It's not going to work.
the results won't be meaningful. So once we have a validated model,
Yeah.
what can we actually do with it?
That's when the real fun begins.
Okay.
We can analyze the mechanics of movement in a way that's just impossible in the real world.
Cool.
We can break down complex movements into their parts, studying how joints, muscles, and forces all interact.
Okay, so we've built our model, captured the real-world data, made sure it all aligns. What happens next?
Well, the next step is to figure out how our virtual skeleton moves to match the motion we recorded.
Okay.
This is called inverse kinematics.
Inverse kinematics. Break that down for me.
Think of it like a puzzle. We know the starting and ending positions of the body from the motion capture.
Right.
Inverse kinematics is figuring out the angles of each joint
Okay.
that were needed to make that movement happen, like reverse engineering the motion frame by frame.
So we're saying, given this final position, what were all the joint movements that got us there?
Exactly. But we don't just stop there.
Right.
Once we have the joint angles, we go deeper with inverse dynamics.
Okay, inverse dynamics. What's that about?
This is where we calculate the forces and torques.
Okay.
Essentially, the rotational forces acting at each joint
Mm-hmm.
to produce the movement. It's like figuring out the engine behind those joint angles, the forces driving the movement.
So inverse kinematics tells us the joint angles, and inverse dynamics tells us the forces and torques behind those angles.
Right. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing more complexity each time.
Yeah.
But aren't there a lot of ways to achieve the same movement?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And that's where muscle redundancy comes in.
Okay.
Our bodies have so many muscles, more than we need for some tasks.
Right.
So how do we figure out which ones are actually doing what? Which ones are contributing the most?
That's a good question. How do we solve that puzzle?
Well, that's where static optimization comes in.
Okay.
We use fancy algorithms to estimate which muscles are active and how much force they're generating. This helps us understand how our brain coordinates muscle activity
Right.
to create smooth and efficient movement.
So we're essentially trying to find the most efficient way to achieve that movement,
Yes.
given all the different muscles that could be involved.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the coolest things about NMS modeling.
Okay.
The ability to analyze movement patterns in different populations, like people with certain medical conditions. But before we get carried away, how do we even know these simulations are reliable?
That's a great question.
I mean, they're just computer models.
That's why validation is so important at every single step.
Yeah.
We need to be sure our virtual world reflects the real one.
Right, so it's not just building a cool model.
No.
It's about making sure it works
Yeah.
and gives us meaningful results.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
It starts with finding the right level of complexity.
Okay.
Enough detail to capture the nuances of human movement, but not so much that it becomes impossible to run the simulations.
Right, so it's
Yeah.
a balance
Yeah, delicate balance.
between realism and practicality. What else?
Well, the muscle properties have to be accurate.
Oh.
We spend a lot of time fine-tuning parameters, like maximum muscle force, making sure they align with research.
So we're constantly refining and tweaking the model to make sure
Absolutely.
it reflects how muscles behave.
As in-
Any other checks and balances?
Yeah, the final step is to compare the simulation results
Okay.
to actual measurements taken from people.
Oh, okay.
For instance, do the predicted joint angles from the model match what we see in the motion captured data?
Right.
Do the muscle activations match the EMG readings?
So it's like a final exam for the model,
Ex-
making sure it can predict what we see in real life.
And it's that rigor,
Yeah.
that gives us confidence in the results. It's not just pretty pictures, it's real data
Okay, cool.
that can be used in research, clinical practice, even athletics.
That's amazing. It sounds like we're just scratching the surface here
Oh, yeah.
of what NMS modeling can do. What other applications are researchers exploring?
Oh, so many. Like in sports science,
Okay.
NMS modeling can be used to analyze and optimize athletic techniques,
Interesting.
identify injury risks, even personalized training programs.
So we could see a future where athletes use these simulations to improve
Yes,
and prevent injuries.
absolutely. And in the medical field, they're studying everything from osteoarthritis to cerebral palsy,
Oh, wow.
understanding how conditions affect movement, developing new rehab strategies,
Right.
designing assistive devices like prosthetics.
It's amazing to think that these virtual models can have such
Oh,
a
yeah.
real impact.
It is, right. And as the technology advances, we can expect even more. Incredible applications.
I know, right? It's amazing how far we've come. And the best part is we're using these models to actually help people.
Exactly. And our source dives into this really impactful use case, stroke rehabilitation. It's such a powerful example of how understanding movement on this level can lead to better treatments.
Absolutely. Strokes are a leading cause of disability, and so many survivors struggle with walking, their gait, as we call it. And it's not just one issue, it's a whole cascade of things.
Yeah, the source mentions muscle weakness, which makes sense. But then there's this thing called spasticity. What exactly is that?
Imagine your muscles are stuck in overdrive, constantly contracting. That's spasticity. Causes stiffness, involuntary movements, makes walking difficult, painful even. It's like the muscles are getting the wrong signals from the brain.
So it's not just about strength, it's about control, too. The source also mentions impaired motor control.
Right. After a stroke, the brain might have trouble coordinating those smooth, intentional movements. Like the communication lines between the brain and the muscles have been disrupted.
And on top of that, there can be sensory deficits, too, right?
Yes, exactly. Stroke survivors might have a hard time feeling where their body is in space. Imagine trying to walk when you can't fully feel your feet or legs. It adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Wow, it's like they're navigating a whole new world, but it's their own body. So how do these virtual models help with all of that? It sounds like we need all the insight we can get.
That's where these models really shine. Researchers can build a virtual twin of a stroke patient, like a personalized digital version of their body and how they move. And using those inverse problem techniques, they can analyze the person's walk, pinpoint the specific problems that are causing difficulties.
So they can see which muscles are weak, which are overactive, which joints aren't moving right. It's like X-ray vision for movement.
It really is. We can even measure things like how much energy they're using with each step, how their balance is affected by different movements. That kind of detail was impossible to get before.
And it doesn't stop there, right? You can actually use the models to test out different treatments.
You got it. Using the forward problem, we can simulate how different therapies might affect that virtual twin. So we can see how they respond to a new exoskeleton or a specific exercise program before trying it in real life.
That's amazing. Like a digital testing ground for treatments. Takes out so much of the guesswork.
Exactly. And every stroke is different. Every recovery is unique. So these models let us tailor the interventions to the person's specific needs and predict which approaches are most likely to work. It's a huge step towards personalized, effective care.
It's like a custom roadmap for recovery. Really incredible how this technology can bring such a human-centered approach to healthcare.
Couldn't agree more. And this is just the beginning. There's so much more these models can do beyond stroke rehab.
Oh, I bet. Well, our source gives us some pretty tantalizing hints about what's coming. One thing that jumped out at me was using data from wearables, like smartwatches, fitness trackers, to study how we move in everyday life.
Yeah, that's going to be huge. Imagine tracking people's movement not just in a lab, but out in the real world, going about their day.
It'd be like having this constant stream of data, showing how our bodies actually function in all sorts of situations.
Exactly. We could study movement patterns across different groups, identify early signs of problems, and develop more personalized solutions.
So not just athletes or patients, we're talking about understanding movement for everyone.
Absolutely. It could revolutionize how we think about injury prevention, workplace design, even making products that better support how we move.
But hold on, all that data coming in, how do we even make sense of it? Sounds overwhelming.
That's where machine learning comes in. Those algorithms can handle massive amounts of data, find patterns we'd never see on our own.
It's like having a superpowered research assistant helping us connect the dots.
Exactly. Machine learning can personalize treatment plans even more, predict who's at risk, even uncover new things about how the brain controls movement.
Speaking of the brain, our source also talks about using these models to understand that whole complex control center better. It's like we've built this amazing virtual body, but still figuring out how the brain is calling the shots.
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting frontiers in this field. Simulating movement, we're getting good at that. But the brain, still a bit of a mystery.
Like we've mastered the puppet, but still got to learn the puppeteer's secrets.
Aha, great analogy.
Well, I feel like we've been on an incredible journey in this deep dive, building virtual bodies, exploring the inner workings of movement, even getting a glimpse of the future of this whole field.
It's been quite a ride.
It really has. And if you're as fascinated by this as we are, definitely check out the references in our source material. Tons of great info there. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into the amazing world of neuromusculoskeletal modeling and simulation. Thanks for joining us.